Okay, and we're live. Welcome to Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival. We are Jane Goodall and Jack Bulwer, or Jack Bulwer and Jane Goodall. We are the co-founders of Litquake, and we're streaming live from the Bay Area and around the world tonight. This is our 21st festival, and we're virtual this year because of, we all know why. And our schedule runs, this is our opening night, and we run from October 8th through the 24th.
So we know that you're tired of hearing about these unprecedented times we're living in. In fact, we know you're tired of living in these unprecedented times. But we think that gives Litquake an additional reason to be this year. We know the world outside is relentless and people are looking for real connection. And words and stories can remind us that we're all human, we're all on the same planet together, and they can provide a temporary escape. Stories can even change somebody's mind.
So yes, our festival is all online, but we have a lot of stuff to choose from in the next 2 weeks or 16 days. And unlike Netflix, almost all of it is free.
We want to thank everybody in the literary community for making Litquake happen as it does every year. That would be including our wonderful and very tiny staff that does this festival, the people who donate money to us, those who bought a Litquake mug or Jeopardy mug, our volunteers and our board of directors. And as always, it's a huge group effort and we are so grateful to everyone.
So before we begin this event tonight, we just wanted to remind you of a few things. Don't forget to vote. Don't forget to buy the books because that's why the authors write them. Wear a mask and keep watching at litquake.org for the next 16 days. That's
right. And tonight we are honored to be able to present as our opening night Kevin Kwan in conversation with Amy Tan. Many thanks to the wonderful 7x7 magazine for being the co-presenter of this event. Quick orders of business, please feel free to submit a question on the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. If there is time toward the end, we will field those questions and let Amy and Kevin answer a few. After the event, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey, and we hope you'll do this because these things are critical to our fundraising efforts. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can support Amy and Kevin by buying their books, either visiting your local bookstore or find our Litquake bookshelf at bookshop.org. We also ask you, as we always do, to consider supporting Litquake. It is a nonprofit and we bring you these events for free. If you believe in helping keep literature a critical part of the literary and cultural landscape, please consider donating to us on Venmo, PayPal, or even at litquake.org. So now let's get on with the show. Quick bios on the two people that you're here to see tonight. Kevin Kwan is the author, as you know, of Crazy Rich Asians, the international best-selling novel that has been translated into more than 30 languages. Its sequel, China Rich Girlfriend, was released in 2015, and Rich People Problems, the final book of the trilogy, followed in 2017. For several weeks in 2018, the Crazy Rich Asians trilogy commanded the top 3 positions of the New York Times bestseller list. I'm not sure that's ever happened before. And the film adaptation of Crazy Rich Asians became Hollywood's highest grossing romantic comedy in over a decade, and it was absolutely fabulous. I hope you got to see it. In 2018, Kevin was named by Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, good Lord. And his new novel, Sex and Vanity, is a daring homage to E.M. Forster's A Room with a View, one of my personal favorites, and a brilliantly funny comedy of manners set between two cultures. The film adaptation is, of course, already in progress. So Kevin will be joined in conversation by Amy Tan, who really almost needs no introduction, but I'll do a quick one anyway. She's, of course, the author of too many New York Times bestsellers to mention, starting with The Joy of Luck Club and including Bonesetter's Daughter, Kitchen God's Wife, 100 Secret Senses, and 2 memoirs, where the past begins and the opposite of fate. She is probably the only author at Litquake this year to play herself in a Simpsons episode, and she has appeared on Sesame Street, and this is the best one of all, she has a new species of leech named after her, which perhaps she will be willing to discuss. And for decades, she has been the backup singer and dominatrix role in the all-author band, the Rock Bottom Remainders. So please welcome Kevin and Amy, if you guys will turn your little videos back on and your audio. There she is, and there's Kevin too. And I will vanish until a bit later.
All right. So I'm going to start it off by saying how much I love this book, Sex and Vanity. First of all, this is brilliant, wicked satire. It is in the tradition of novels on manners, social standing, culture, such as Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I would say there's something kind of like Edith Wharton, if we're looking at American novels. But as Jane pointed out, this has a lot of literary allusions to A Room with a View. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But what I want to say about the way this book is set up, this is a world many of us are never going to occupy. We're never going to be the insider. We're always going to be the outsider. And yet, when you read this book, it's so delicious because we get to be the insiders. And one of the reasons why is that Kevin has created this device, which is footnotes. And, you know, as you go through these things, there might be some allusions to something in culture, couture, or whatever that you wouldn't really know. And it's not explaining it to you like you're an idiot, but it's explaining it to you in a way almost as if the characters don't know it. Somebody's whispering to you at a party, and that's Kevin giving you the inside thing, like, oh, actually, it's not this, or she's lying. And so you get to be at the party and hear these things liberally sprinkled about. And through that, you also know in this satire some of the vulnerabilities, the foibles of these people. I was going to say the only leech we should talk about is Mordecai, you know. People who poach, not just, you know, trying to get the free lunch or whatever, but also on to grab a little bit of having some of the social standing rub off in them. These are people who have arrived in society recently and are snobs, and there are also people who arrived on the Mayflower and they're snooty. So it's just delicious. I want to get to, just before we get into all this other stuff about Kevin, the writer, tell me about your choice of A Room with a View. Why that particular novel? And what about that did you take? What aspects of the characters and their names, what were the reasons behind that?
I mean, first of all, it's always been one of my favorite novels. And not only that, one of my favorite films, you know, starting when I was 16 years old. So it's always been on my mind. It's always a book that's influenced me. It sort of, you know, made me fall in love with Italy for the first time. I went to Capri and I went to Florence because of the book. So it's, you know, his writing has, you know, really holds a dear place in my heart. So when I was offered a chance to write a new book outside of the Crazy Rich Asians trilogy, you know, my publishers were trying to entice me to come back to writing because I was on this Hollywood adventure, you know, writing for TV and doing screenplays. I was like, okay, I'll do this provided I can go to Italy and write a novel, you know, and sort of cheat a little bit by paying homage to A Room with a View, you know, after writing, you know, I don't know, 1,500 pages worth of this crazy rich trilogy. I wanted something just fresh and fun and just, you know, something that would be easier. So I initially was thinking of writing a 150-page novella. And of course, it just, you know, once you start writing, as you know, it mushrooms into whatever it wants to be. And so it became a much more different book. But the departure point was from my love for the book, A Room with a View.
In case some of you have not read A Room with a View, which you should, or see the movie, you know, there's two women who have gone to Florence, and they find that the pensione that they have booked in has switched their rooms. They do not have the room with a view. They have, you know, some horrible thing. And they're complaining about this, and two people over here offer their rooms. It's a man, in this case, it's a man and his son. And from there, there's interactions with these people, and especially this son, that leads to complications, and there's a fiancé involved in love and just interactions, and that forms the basis of the storyline. But what I found really funny too is that you used the same names for many of the characters. So the main character, Lucy Churchill, there's a Lucy Churchill in the E.M. Forster book. There's a Charlotte Bartlett, there's George, there's Mr. Beebe, who is a vicar, and now he is a yoga guru. He's a puppy yoga guru. You know, I mean, I just thought when I was reading this, I thought, he had so much fun. You just had so much, you know, you must have been laughing while you were writing this book.
I really did. I wanted to subvert one of my favorite books. And I wanted to also, you know, E.M. Forster wrote that book in 1908. And it is timeless and it's relevant. And the way he captured the internal life of a girl who's caught really between two time periods. You know, Lucy Honeychurch, her character, you know, his character, is a girl growing up sort of caught between the Edwardian age, which she's part of, and the Victorian age, which was her mother's generation. And then, of course, you have my Lucy, who is Lucy Tang Churchill, a biracial, you know, half Chinese, half New York WASP. And she's caught really between two cultures and two class systems and two worlds. So I really wanted to have fun with that. And so, yeah, here and there, I used the characters. I played a lot of games with scenes from the movie and like re-subverted them. I just wanted to have fun. But I also, you know, was looking to sort of explore, you know, deeper issues also within the book.
Yeah, you did. I mean, one of them was being biracial and belonging in two worlds, which I sense was something about your upbringing, that you were in Singaporean society, the high society, and a world that was normal to you. And then later on, you moved to Texas. I don't know how big that town was, but it seemed like it was a drastic change. So you had these two lives that you occupied, and I just wondered, what was your sense of self as Singaporean, as an American or a Texan, and also as Chinese, which I know that as a Singaporean, you don't necessarily think of yourself first and foremost as a race, but you know, in America, in the United States, they do go by, it doesn't matter if you're from Singapore, you're Chinese. So talk a little bit about, you know, being in those different worlds.
Yeah, you know, I've always felt like an outsider from any culture, you know, any class system, any tribe. I've never felt like I really fit in, but I am also, you know, I feel like I was very caught between two worlds, especially when I moved here to the US at age 11, you know, coming from Singapore, coming from a very sheltered, pampered upbringing, and then moving to suburban Houston, Texas. It was a shock to the system. And I was actually telling a young friend of mine today that when I first, you know, I was 11 years old and I was starting school for the first time in an American school. I didn't know how to do American school. I was used to going to a private school in Singapore, and I was used to having a nanny, you know, literally tie my shoelaces for me, you know, as I would go to school. Before I went, you know, I would have an ironed uniform and this and that. And here I was in America, and my parents, I asked them, you know, like, will they be there in the morning when I go to school? And they were horrified at the thought of like having to get up for me and like, you know, make breakfast or something. They were like, oh, well, you know, go to school. Yeah, school starts at 8 o'clock. You know how to get there. Go do it. Like the thought of them,
No chauffeur,
no chauffeur. So they really, it's like I got thrown into the deep end of the swimming pool, which I think in a way was exactly what my father wanted to do for me. You know, he really wanted us to immerse into American culture and also to be independent, you know, and learn to fend for ourselves.
Not be a trust fund baby.
Exactly. But I think it was interesting because you know, in Singapore, it was already such a cosmopolitan city. You know, I grew up having Hapa, you know, Eurasian cousins. I grew up in a neighborhood where my neighbor was a British girl and a New Zealand boy next door and an Indian boy across the street. And so it was very like UN, you know, you grew up in a very multicultural society. So I didn't feel like I was in any way different. I felt like I was part of a spectrum of different races and, you know, so I went to American school and didn't really have the same issues, I think, that Asian Americans grew up experiencing. And I didn't realize that until much later. You know, I went to school as this, you know, kind of weird little kid, right, with a strange British accent. Immediately people thought I was from China, but then I started speaking in this posh British accent, and then they couldn't figure me out. And, you know, they called me Fernando. That was my nickname. Because it was, I don't know how that emerged, but I was sort of exotic and strangely quasi-European to them, you know, to my classmates. So it was, you know, in journalism class, actually, that became my nickname, Fernando. And I was happy with that. And it was interesting. So I didn't grow up with the same baggage. I had different baggage, but I never had a sense of an Asian identity. It was very rooted in Singapore. I was from Singapore. I was English speaking, and this is who I am, you know?
Why did your father want your family to move to Houston, of all places? I mean, you know, there are other places that have a large Asian population. And I do know Houston has a community there.
Well, Asian. At that time it was tiny. No, now there's a huge, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of Asians in Houston now, an amazing Asian food scene. Back then, there was nothing. Like I was one of 3 Asian kids in my whole high school.
So, sorry, I have this phone thing I have to turn off, but I don't know how to do that.
So I was one of 3 Asian kids, and my dad, he had business there, you know, and we also had relatives there. So you go where family and work is, basically. So there were a big combination of reasons why.
So once you went from being in this different society in Singapore, you're in the United States, in Houston, you know, people think you're this weird kid. Did you get a sense of being an outsider? Did that sense stay with you? Do you feel that once we're in, you know, take on this identity of insider, outsider, what part of that stays with you? I mean, who are you today? Insider, outsider, you're Kevin, of course. But what is it that you bring into your writing? You know, I always think that displacement is a good thing for a writer.
Absolutely. And of course I was a complete outsider to that world, of course, you know, of Houston, Texas, of like a classic American high school.
Did you want to belong? I mean,
you know, I didn't even intuit that. You know, I was just going through my day and trying to survive, you know. And it's interesting because I didn't really even fully integrate into that world of the American high school because there was so much going on at home. There was so much drama going on at home. And I really had my own life, you know, outside of school. So there was never a craving to belong to that crowd. I always felt rooted in who I was and my family and where I truly belonged. So I think I was secure in that. In a strange paradox, you know what I mean? I didn't have that issue, but I always could sense, you know, whether it was being in Houston or even moving to New York and going to art school there and having a career there, I would always be a sort of outsider, and I'm very comfortable with outsider status. I think as someone who is sort of in the creative world, you benefit from being on the periphery. You benefit from being a fly on the wall and observing all these worlds, you know. And for me, belonging to them would be kind of a curse.
I think the novel is a lot about belonging. You want, these characters want to belong at a certain class level. In fact, it seems like it's a constant stressful striving to belong and to, and in a comparative way. Who's this? Who's that? I wanted to know, did you see a lot of that when you were growing up and looking back? I'm sure it was just normal back then, but looking back, do you now recognize that that was what you were seeing among friends and family?
It's interesting. When you leave a country at age 11, you're old enough to have built up this consciousness of your childhood. But when you leave, it's like a break. It's a fissure. But for me, everything that happened in my first 11 years was crystallized in amber. I can remember scenes. I can remember conversations. I can remember so many things, almost as if I was watching a movie. So yes, I mean, there were so many instances that I could go back to recall. There was someone we knew who were ostracized. I remember we were at church one day, and my parents went to sort of the posh Methodist church in Singapore. And my mom had this friend that she wanted to introduce to her older sister. And the older sister refused to meet this friend. Like they were standing, one was on top of the hill, one was at the bottom. And my mom's like, oh, you have to meet her. She's so great. And my mom's sister was like.
So what were you thinking? You were observing this. I mean, these are the things that stored up in your mind.
Yeah.
And at that time, did you have any thoughts about what that was about?
Oh, absolutely. I was fascinated because I knew the insider gossip. This woman was involved in a scandal. And I'd heard all about the scandal, because I was always around when my mom and her friends were gossiping, at Bible study and things like that. So I would overhear things. And so I knew that, oh, this is why this aunt doesn't want to meet this woman, because she's not respectable. She's, so she like cut her dead, So that's one example of something I remember. And then I also remember, going to these parties, as a kid. I think, as a lot of Asian society, the children are always there. The children are always invited.
Yeah.
They're
always
yeah, exactly.
In Chinese and in English,
Exactly.
You're
and I was that kid that I never liked to go upstairs and play with the other kids. I always wanted to be downstairs where the adults were, and kind of tuning into the action there. For some reason,
always from a young age, you were the observer. And you were hearing stories at the same time. And do you feel, I have a sense that this is true, that you developed your storytelling love as a result of that being imbued in you from an early age? Is that?
Absolutely. But it wasn't at least a decade later that I actually started writing.
Yeah.
I was storing all these things. I was observing, but I was lucky in a way that I was able to be that one single kid in a room full of adults as they are talking, as they are gossiping. And, I had an aunt who was, really a seminal person in my life. She was the first person that really took an interest in helping me read,
Oh.
She was a librarian and a journalist. So she would assign me books. And, we would talk about them, and then she would take me to museums and places. She was very much like this Auntie Mame character, and her set of friends were this amazing bohemian range, from artists to a Thai princess to a former banker. And so I would be in that mix. Every Sunday we would be at Sunday brunch, and I would be the little 8-year-old kid with these, 50, 60-year-old people, hearing all the local political gossip, what was happening, that week in Parliament, what was happening in the finance world. And I was like a sponge. I soaked it all in.
Yeah. I'm sorry, continue if you.
Yeah, I soaked it all in, and it all came tumbling out.
Yeah.
30 years later. Yeah.
When did you get the sense that you wanted to be a writer? Because you did enroll and take creative writing courses. So there must have been a moment where you said, I'm pretty good at this and I want to start writing stories.
Yeah, it was in college. It really
Mhm.
began in college, and it
Mhm.
actually began really more in my sophomore year. You know, I decided to major and really focus on media studies and literature, and then I started taking creative writing classes.
Mhm.
And initially, poetry was what I wanted to write poetry, like contemporary experimental poetry. So I did that for a while and was part of the local poetry scene in Houston and did a lot of poetry slams and the
So when,
festivals, you know, that whole world of
yeah,
submitting your poem to 10 journals and maybe you'll get into one of them,
yeah.
you know.
So you figure you're going to continue with this. But did you think you could ever make a living? Did it occur to you, gee, I want to be a published fiction writer? Or
You know, I
were
wasn't
you going to
even,
do your company? You know, were you going to just be practical? You know, I mean, Asians tend to be practical too. You can dream about doing stuff, but you have to be work hard, be self-sufficient. So
I
did you?
never imagined that I would ever get published. You know, this was always just a fantasy. I did this, but after graduating, it was time to get serious, right? And I graduated from college in 1994, which was kind of the middle of a recession in the 90s. And so I did what everyone does, you know, when you can't get a job, you go to grad school, you know. So I went to grad school at University of Houston. I was going to double down and study creative writing and literature and then go into teaching, go into academia. That was the track I was on. And then in the middle of my first year, I realized, you know, I'm 21 years old. I have nothing to write about. I haven't lived, you know. So I really sort of wanted to shake up my world. So I always knew there was a visual side to me, you know. Even back in the creative writing program, even when I was writing poetry, one of my professors, he used to call me, you know, you're the designer poet, you know, because I was always dropping little things and I would use the word Armani-esque in a poem, you know. So there's always this intensely visual side and a cinematic side to my poetry. And so I said, well, I'm going to go to art school. I'm going to go to New York and have this adventure because there is this visual side to me. And if I can integrate the writer, the good writing skills I've learned and visual expertise and learning how to use the computer and, you know, do things like program websites, like maybe I'll be able to get a job. And I actually did that. I integrated both, you know, into a consulting career for 15 years.
You seem to have had a lot of luck, it seems, in falling into these situations where you end up meeting really, really interesting people. And say in New York in the art world, you had some kind of landlord or something, and he just took you along to wherever he was going to live. And it turned out to be this fascinating place. Can you?
Yeah, I mean,
and I mentioned this
yeah.
because a lot of your book concerns art, modern art especially. And, you know, I kept thinking, how does he know these things? So did you get a lot of that background, that sensibility for art because of the people that you met during that time?
It was both that and I was at Parsons School of Design. You know, I was in art school. So I was really doing a very multidisciplinary degree for myself. So I was taking photography classes and design classes and interior design classes. I really wanted to learn, you know, all these different visual genres, you know. And so for me, I don't know where it came from. I always just wanted to be around interesting people. And actually, I do know where it came from. I'm just really making this link right now for the first time. It came from hanging around with my aunt and her circle of people. You know, there was always this amazing diversity of, you know, she knew the leading architect in Singapore, you know, that studied with Walter Gropius at Harvard. And, you know, she had her other dear friend who was this amazing Thai princess, you know, so like I was always looking to be around interesting people. And so, of course, when you're in New York, you know, in the 90s, it was such an amazing time to be there and to work for Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. You know, I was there 2 days a week, and the other 3 days I was at Martha Stewart's magazine. So I had a very uptown and downtown life.
Wow.
And all these fascinating people just sort of fell into my life. Yeah, including my crazy landlord, you know. This was one summer. I was living in a building where the landlord only wanted to have beautiful Scandinavians. He only rented, it was this beautiful West Village building, but he only rented to like the sons and daughters of Scandinavian diplomats and kids that were working, at the UN summer program from Denmark or Norway. And for some reason, he took a liking to me. And I was like the one really non-Scandinavian in the building. But it was, it was a really kind of fascinating time to be there.
So you had this very successful company. You have all this multidisciplinary knowledge, education, experience. When did you really decide, I'm going to sit down and write a novel? And why?
Yeah.
What influenced you? What was your decision?
I think more and more I was working on publishing projects, and I did a book for Elizabeth Taylor. I did a book, I was doing a lot of books for other writers, like Valerian McMurtry and Michael Korda. And so I was influenced so much by all these other writers and thinking, I do want to attempt a book, regardless of whether I get it published. I feel like it would be a life goal to just write a book. And for so many years, I would go back to Asia and visit, and I would come back and I would tell my friends all these stories, these crazy stories of what I would encounter, because the Asia I got to see when I went to Hong Kong or I went to Bangkok wasn't the tourist Asia. It was the privileged 1% Asia. And so I would tell them these crazy stories of, arriving in Hong Kong and there would be 4 maids waiting at the airport to receive me, to take my luggage, and I wouldn't, of course, let them, for me, like, no, I'm going to carry my own luggage, like, I'm not going to let these tiny women like touch my luggage. But it was just such a different way of life,
Who sent the maids?
A relative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you still had, it seemed like your parents were more grounded in giving you a kind of a normal life, but you still had surrounding you the family that did embrace the trappings of very wealthy people.
Yeah. I mean, my father was very grounded, and my father was very much, he was a very, very down to earth guy, and he had no interest in society or its trappings or anything like that. My mother is much more cosmopolitan. She's much more a Singapore girl, but so, I would come back with all these stories, and friends would say over and over again, oh, you need to write this down. You just, this is crazy. What's happening? You need to write it down. So in 2009, my father got sick, and I took time off work and I went down to Houston where he was getting treatment. And I would be driving him every day to his either radiation or chemotherapy or whatever. And we had a lot of time, in the car together, commuting, in rush hour traffic. And I just decided I would just ask him so many things I wanted to know about his childhood. Because he was a very quiet man, like I told you, very unassuming, extremely humble, very down to earth. But when I would look at the photo albums, these old pictures of his, the man I saw in the pictures was very different from the man I knew. In his albums, he was sent to Australia to go to boarding school and then to college. He had a different suit on in every picture, a different snazzy tie. He had his motorcycle. He had all these cars. He had this amazing very playboy life. And I wanted to know about that. And I wanted to know about his youth. There's a photograph of him walking through the botanical gardens with his 2 little sisters. And behind him are 2 maids, 2 of those black and white maids, the traditional Cantonese amas in their black and white uniforms. And then behind them were a row of these Sikh bodyguards, And so I would show him these pictures and say, who's that, and and he'd like, oh, that was my nanny, and who are those, do you know that group of Sikh people? And he's like, yeah, those were the bodyguards, So I wanted to know more and more about that world, because I did feel like, the sand in the hourglass was running down, and I didn't want to not know. And in a way that really inspired and compelled me to want to put these stories down,
So aspects, that down-to-earth character. Is he in your book there? I mean, we always think about the over-the-top, super rich, crazy Asians in there, but was there a character? I mean, I sense it's George in a way. He's Australian. He seems more down to earth. He doesn't always wear the fancy stuff. He doesn't always really care. Was that influenced?
I mean,
by
that's a
your...
fascinating link. I never thought about that. But I think, as you know, like your characters are always amalgams of so many people, right? That come and move in and out of your life.
Yeah.
And now that you mention it, yeah, there is a bit of my dad and George. You know, this sort of unfussy, matter of fact, you know, guy that has no patience for the trappings.
Values. Yeah. So you started to write the first book, and all these details. I mean, I said this already, you know, I'd be reading this and saying, well, Crazy Rich Asians, you know, when I first read that book, they say, how does he know these things? And again, reading Sex and Vanity is like, how do you know all the couture names of what the latest is? How do you know the prices of these things? I mean, you were educated in this area that included the disciplines that would, inform you of how you look at that, but the labels, the names of the interior designers, the architects, all of that. Is that just at your fingertips so that as you're writing quickly, you could just, oh yeah, I'll throw in this. Or did you actually do any research? Did you talk to people?
I really don't do any research. My mind is a sponge of useless information, like architects and interior designers and antique dealers. And I mean, this is a world that I sometimes see and kind of observe. You know, I have friends that do wear couture, and I was lucky enough to attend the couture shows, you know, on several occasions. And so this is always the world of sort of luxury and design is something I've always known. And it became part of my career, you know, as a design consultant. This is what you need to know, right? When you're consulting on a book or consulting on a project for an architect, you need to be able to make those references. This is my font of useless information.
Yeah, what's funny is, I think one of the funny things is you have that store of information. You can just drop it casually, as do these people. And one of the great things, if you're a snob, is that you name drop and you drop, you know, the queen or the princess, the baron, whatever. And I'm wearing, you know, such and such, but I was also, I would start laughing because you would also name things that were really not of that class. I'm thinking of the time that was it Cecil who's going to go to the apartment of his fiancé or his grandmother, and he's thinking, oh, it'll probably be it'll look like it was designed by Frank Campbell. Okay, this is kind of an insider joke. And because I live part-time in New York, I know what that means, but I just felt that Frank Campbell was like the funeral home in New York. You know, if you are able
for the Upper East Side crowd.
If you are able to afford a good funeral, you get it at Frank Campbell. So, you know, when you talk about interior design by Frank Campbell, you know, I cracked up. But that made me think, what else am I missing there? You know, you drop so many references, cultural references. And it made me think also how much of our identity unconsciously may be related to these cultural references, not at that level necessarily, of course, you know, unless we were super billionaires. But we have elements in our life that are tied to those kinds of cultural references. And so I really appreciate that. I found myself thinking, oh, you know, do I see myself in that particular way? You know, icebreaker. Is that a cultural reference to anything that says something about me other than I like clothes that feel like pajamas. I wanted to know, of course, everybody. I mean, this gets asked of me too, you know, like, do people identify themselves in the book, and are your friends and family, are they scared to be around you, thinking they're going to be in your book? Has that happened to you? Do you have people getting mad at you or saying they, you know, why did you write about me? Or don't write about me. I'm going to tell you this thing, but don't write about it. And of course you do.
That's never happened, because I am very, very, very careful not to offend anyone. And
Mhm.
I'm not a spiller of secrets. I'm not a scandal monger. I'm not even, there's no axe to grind. I'm creating comedy and satire here. So I'm able to take a story and transform it in a way and disguise it in a way where I'm really protecting the innocent and I'm protecting the privacy of people. So enough has changed where no one's truly recognizable,
Yeah.
you know? And of course, like a writer told me once, they're like, oh, you should just change the hair color of every character. And I was like, well, I can't do that. Like all my characters are Asian, you know? So I have to do a lot more sort of very delicate work. So no one's ever come up to me and said, you know,
One of the caveats, of course, in writing is your characters have to be likable.
Mm-hmm.
You have to they're sympathetic. There's qualities, so that even though you're sort of poking fun at this, they have to be human. You want to be on their side. And I feel that with your characters as well. And in this book, Sex and Vanity. So, but I wanted to ask that because, you know, you can poke fun at a society, and yet you will have people, readers, I certainly did, who said, that's me. Actually, they said it quite proudly when they really weren't in the book. They wanted to claim that they were, you know, that's me. So it just, you know, I just thought that there would be people who would say that sounds like me.
I mean, I've heard anecdotally, for example, you know, when the producers of my film went to Asia for the first time to sort of begin planning, they were invited to a lot of society parties, of course, and they said they met at least 21 different women claiming to be Astrid, you know, the character, the most chic, fashionable, giving, philanthropic, beautiful character. Like they all said, you know, I'm the inspiration for Astrid, and I hadn't heard of a single one of these women. So, because I know who the real Astrid is, you know what I mean?
Well, you know what?
So it's pretty funny.
I noticed also Astrid had a little brief cameo. She was just mentioned in Sex and Vanity as somebody who was going to be at some gala or something.
Yeah, she was at the wedding.
I just love. Yeah, that was it. She was at. But I love these things that were dropped in like that. A little reference to Downton Abbey, a little reference to Henry James. So there's all those little juicy, delectable bits. They're really small, but they are a world as well. I have to tell you an anecdote. Maybe I've told you this before. Shortly after I read this Crazy Rich Asians, which I think I was in Tahoe, and I think I read it nonstop. Instead of going for lovely walks in the forest, I was like reading this book. And shortly after that, we were invited, and this will be the total name drop that I think that you can appreciate. So it's kind of embarrassing for me to say things like this, but we were invited to the White House to have dinner. And at first I thought, wow, this is happening 3 days from now. I'm not going to go. I mean, it's big hassle to go there. And then somebody said, well, you should go. And he said, well, it's a dinner. And we're obviously the people who were the fill-ins, you know, the A-list, the B-list, the C-list. We've gotten down the C-list. Let's see, Amy Tan.
Oh, come on. You were,
okay,
I'm sure you were super A-list.
No, this is true. This is what I'm thinking. Why should we go? And I had been to the White House a number of times. So I'm just thinking that. And then we went, and I was shocked. We were seated at the table with President Obama and Michelle, but also with the guest of honor at the state dinner for, guess who? Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. So he was seated across, and there was a moment when nobody was talking to him. And you know how awkward that is? You're the guest of honor, and everybody's occupied, and you're just sitting there. And so I leaned across the table, and I started talking to him about green architecture And because I know that Singapore has this and they're very proud of it. I was so glad I had something to say. And then he said to me, have you read any good books lately? And I said, yes, I just finished this great book. It's called Crazy Rich Asians. And actually it takes place in Singapore. And the characters, it's really amazing because either people are just over the top rich and they have these, and then all of a sudden I stopped. And I thought, oh my God, you know, if this is based on real characters, Prime Minister knows these people. And so I just kind of stopped and said, well, you know, it's just a real, it's a fun book to read or something. He said, what is the book again? What is it called? He was going to write this down. So maybe I sold one of your books to fellow Singaporean. Yeah. So that was, you know, I just, and maybe he really did enjoy it, you know, and I have to say, he seemed like a very down to earth kind of person. He was the kind of person who said, when I was talking about green architecture, and I said, he said, let me see your cell phone. You know, I want to see show me your photos. So to me, he seemed like a very down to earth guy who would really enjoy your book on society. I'm sure he has a take on society as well. Let's go to movies. I don't know, how much time do we have? I want to make sure we have time for questions, but I want to get to this thing about the movies that everybody, I'm sure, is curious about. You did one fantastic Crazy Rich Asians, so successful. I was so happy that did well. I've seen the movie. I own the movie. I hardly ever, I may own 6 movies I've ever bought. I bought this movie and I've probably seen it 5 times. You know, I bought the music. I just really love it. So,
well, can I just tell you very quickly? I mean, you were the gold standard when I thought about this movie, you know, because I'm sure you know by now, you know, The Joy Luck Club is one of my favorite books of all time. And the movie was so special to me. Like, I can't tell you how many people I dragged to go see the movie when it was in the theaters. I saw it maybe 4 times in the theaters. But I just, I've never asked you what you actually thought of the movie, but I always thought it was such a beautiful adaptation. You know, Wayne Wang, right?
Wayne Wang, and I was the co-writer and the co-producer. So I loved the movie.
To me, it was so perfectly done. And so that was, to me, the model of what we wanted to create with Crazy Rich Asians. And, you know, also we were the first all-Asian cast since your movie, you know, so we felt like we had this legacy to really live up to. So thank you, first of all, for paving the way, because
we both know these movies are not going to get made unless they are box office hits, unless they are commercially successful. And that's, you know, much more so than Joy Luck Club was so commercially successful, Crazy Rich Asians, that it enables others to make movies with Asian actors, with stories that I think apply to everybody, but happen to be in a setting that may be more Asian influenced. Did you feel this burden of responsibility of how these characters were going to be depicted? Because I'm sure, you know, in my case, people are always talking about when you pitch these movies that some of them would say, well, how about making one of the characters white? Did you have anything like that happen to you?
That happened in the very, very beginning. You know, when the book was first making the rounds, you know, as you know, in Hollywood, when people were first considering it, one producer, you know, basically offered to make the movie, but said, well, I want to change Rachel Chu and make her white, you know. And I was like, not interested. Sorry, you've missed the whole point of the book, and you will miss the whole point of the movie. So not interested. Yeah. And I think, you know, everyone else though had, you know, really shared my vision of what this movie needed to be. And if you know, this was back in 2013. This was even way before the whole Hollywood whitewashing and all, you know, this was, you know, there were amazing people of integrity that felt like this deserved to be just what it was, you know, and all Asian cast. And sorry, you had a question.
No. I was just, again, with this movie, and you're so lucky with your director and all the other people involved, you know.
It really was a really sort of magical kind of blessed experience because John Chu, you know, was such an amazing director, had such a vision, and we brought, you know, we were able to together assemble this amazing cast of people, you know, from Michelle Yeoh to Henry Golding to Aquafina, you know, all these people who are now huge superstars, you know. But you could see all that raw talent.
Henry Golding, everybody's little fantasy. A hero. He's just so nice. You know, he's so handsome. Is that voice? And anyway, the casting was great. So did you have anything to do with writing, with casting, or any of those things?
Not with the writing. You know, I just felt like this movie was so important to get right that I at that point had no experience in screenwriting. So I was like, no, I want someone else I want the best people possible to do this.
Were you a subject matter expert, you know, on
Oh yeah, absolutely. No. Yeah, I was, as a producer, I was involved every step of the way. I was sending them Google Map locations of, you know, I was helping to location scout. I was wrangling clothing and jewelry. And there's even a scene where there's a Rolex watch. You know, Astrid gives her husband a Rolex watch.
Oh yeah, right.
And it was originally going to be another watch from a different brand, you know, and John Chu, to his credit, you know, he really wanted authenticity.
It was a Rolex? I thought it was a Philippe Petit.
No, it was a Rolex, but it was so originally it was another brand watch, which I'll not be, you know, named. But he asked me, like, is this what Astrid would give Michael? And I said, absolutely not. She would never give this brand of a watch. You know, she would give him a beautiful vintage Rolex Paul Newman Daytona. You know, and so we found one from a collector, and it was, you know, a $500,000 watch that we flew across the world with its own bodyguard for its 1 second scene, you know. So it was really fun to like really try to help preserve those authentic details.
So what about Sex and Vanity? What is in the, I heard that there's going to be a movie made. Well, you can talk about all of them. There's going to be a sequel. And I'm really interested. I know that the ending was changed. There are a number of things changed with Crazy Rich Asians. So the ending was changed a little bit from the book. And I wonder, how do you pick up from there? Here you have an ending that's different from the book. And now you're going to do the second book. And you're going to have to start at a place that differs from the beginning. Is that something you're going to solve, or you're going to work with people and say, well, you know, now we have Mom, you know, I'm not going to give it, I don't want to say
so
too
funny.
much,
I mean,
because if people haven't read these, I don't want to give it away too much. If you've seen the movie, there's some little differences there.
You've nailed the essential problem, and they're trying to figure it out now. And yeah, I'm sort of helping, but I'm very hands-off with that creative team, because I feel so confident in them. And I feel like I need, you know, for me, once you give up a book, it's like giving up a baby for adoption. You really have to let the new team raise it and shape it how it will, you know? And I'm there to consult, but I'm never there to like interfere, you know?
Well, I think that because you know them so well, you know the characters, you know the story, and all of the, you know, backstory in this, it just seems to me you would have to be the one who would contribute to the storyline and how this happens with character, because the complications of the story itself depends on this particular beginning of the second book that has now been changed.
So it's interesting. I'm there to consult, and I've been advising, but not my problem. So happy to say, not my problem, you know. So they're working on the sequel now for Crazy Rich Asians. You know, things of course have been slowed down because of the pandemic. They were going to film this fall, but it's probably going to be next year. And then Sony Pictures has bought Sex and Vanity. And I can say, I think I'm allowed to say, we hired a screenwriter. It's going to be an amazing screenwriter. I can't say who yet, but I'm working with
Is it an Asian screenwriter, or?
I'm
now
not
this is a question.
Say anything.
Okay.
But,
because this is something always asked me. You know, there's this thing about appropriation, and you need to have the Asian director, the Asian this and this. And so I was just curious what have been some of the pressures placed on you. But
Amy and Kevin, can you hear me?
Yeah,
we can.
I think it's time to move to a few questions from the audience. And if you don't mind, I'll just sort of throw out a few of these. Some of them have already been answered, kind of.
Oh, I was going to get into gossip with Kevin about people. No, I'm just kidding. We'll do that
Put
later.
it offline. Yeah.
I have a lot of gossip I want to ask you.
This is an interesting question from Selena, who's also a Singaporean. She says, how do you deal with the urge to translate and explain for people outside the culture that you're writing about? When is it too much explaining?
You know, that's where my footnotes come in. And that's how I originally kind of decided to use footnotes in Crazy Rich Asians, because there were so many things, you know, words, slang terms, little cultural issues that I just felt like it would get in the way if I tried to tell it within the narrative of the story. So I started telling them in the footnotes. You know, that's where I can really translate a really great swear word and
Yeah.
tell you what it's about.
But it's more, it comes across like a little whisper to somebody like that.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
It's like the snarky little brother telling you,
Yeah.
you know, the
Yeah.
gossip about
Yeah.
the book.
Yeah.
So
Here's a question that both of you can answer. How do you see your role as Asian American storytellers? Do you feel an obligation to tell Asian American stories specifically, and do you fear being boxed in?
that's a really good question. Amy, would you like to start? Yeah.
Well, I don't think I've ever asked the question of myself because I am Asian American, and so I'm naturally drawn to the stories that are relevant to me, in part because the reason I write is to have a greater understanding of who I am, what my thoughts are, where they have derived from. So, you know, to write about something else just wouldn't be interesting to me. I do feel at the end of the writing that somebody is going to interpret what I have written as representational of the entire Asian world. And they will be very critical, and they'll say, my mother does not speak with an accent, you know, and I've had that. And I just have to dismiss it and say, you know, I'm writing the stories that are meaningful to me. Many books out there still to be written, write that story.
And speaking for myself, I've always just, maybe it's that rebel in me. I always just write what I want to write. But so much of my writing comes from my truth, right? And so being Asian, these are the stories I want to write about, you know. With Sex and Vanity, it's really an homage to one of my favorite novels, but it's also a Valentine to my time in Manhattan. You know, I lived there for 2 decades. So I feel like Asians will always be in my books in some way, shape, or form. I don't have to worry about, you know, diversity. It's just very organic. But I do feel, now that I've had an experience with Hollywood, and now that I've seen what Crazy Rich Asians, the movie, has done with my other projects, because I'm developing TV and film projects, I do feel an obligation and responsibility now to help showcase the amazing Asian talent that's out there, that's available. So I'm writing new projects, you know, in TV, in film, with the hopes that we'll get amazing Asian stars, Asian directors, Asian, you know, screenwriters, Asian production.
Don't forget the actors that were in the Joy Luck Club. They're fantastic.
They truly, truly, truly are. And I've met so many of them now, you know, over the years. So
Lisa Liu.
This is sort of a follow-up on that. Someone said, as a first-generation Asian American, I'm in awe to see the opening of Asian character stories, and she has young kids. She says, any thoughts on how media will open to one day to see an Asian American action hero, AKA Asian 007?
As opposed to Jackie Chan, who's, I guess, Hong Kong based. Is that, so maybe, you know, are they like an Asian Spider-Man or?
Like, yeah, exactly. Superhero.
I don't know. I'm not in the world of superheroes. So maybe, Kevin, do you have a?
You know, they're developing several now. You know, there's Marvel is doing Shang-Chi, I believe that's the name of the superhero, but he's an Asian superhero from the Marvel comic line. And they're in production filming that, from what I hear. And then, of course, Gemma Chan is also going to play a superhero in some new movie. I'm also very bad with the superheroes, but I know she's doing it. So it is this brave new world where they really are kind of trying to shatter the cliche. And it would be amazing. I cannot wait for the day when there is a 007 type character played by an Asian.
And meanwhile, there is a remake of Mulan, not the animated, but you know, a filmic version. What do you?
A live
how
cat.
yeah,
Live action. Yeah.
live action. Yes.
This one isn't so much a question as a statement. She just wanted to thank you both for being such good role models for Asian Americans in general. Hope to see more come from you in the next generation. And thank you for sharing your passions, loves, and gossip and experiences with all of us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Someone calls in for.
I'm not sure my mom would think I was a good influence, but thank you.
Someone is signing in from Singapore and also the Philippines, and asked if Sex and Vanity is on sale in the Philippines yet. I don't know if you know that.
It sure is. It should be available at all fully booked and national bookstores and more and other stores. But it's done. From what I heard, I was on CNN Philippines last week, that it's doing very well there. So hope you can find it.
Do you have any advice to biracial Asian American writers who are afraid of identifying as Asian?
Wow.
Advice for the writers.
I always just say go for it, you know. And I want to take this moment to also say thank you to you, Amy, because you really paved the way with Valley of Amazement, right? With having a biracial character there.
Oh,
so
you know, in part, I think being biracial is just a very interesting way to enter into a fictional world. You know, as with the Sex and Vanity, you have people who occupy different worlds, whether it's wealth and class, but here you have one that relates to race. And so I would say to this writer, why not do it as a biracial person? And then you get to, you know, be in both worlds and take from those worlds what becomes this character's identity in terms of background and people's reactions. And that to me makes for a fascinating book.
Absolutely.
There's an interesting question here about what your perspective is on the model minority myth and how that shapes your art. And this woman says, incidentally, Melanie Chang, the little girl in Joy Luck Club, was my neighbor in Oregon. Are you the actors?
I'll just, you know, model minority myth. It's actually not just, you know, the thing about Chinese or Asians becoming doctors and all of that, concert pianists. The myth really affects leads to a kind of invisibility of the very serious issues that are facing an Asian community. A very high suicide rate among young people, for example. It's a myth that all Asians are successful. There's a high poverty rate, even higher than some communities that you would think would be the poorest. Also, elder abuse is a problem. Many things that impact this myth really, unfortunately, masks a real community. So I know this thing. I'm involved with organizations that address those issues, so I get to hear about it, be involved in other ways.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. There was a question asking about how, as a writer, do you avoid info dumps? I'm not even sure I know what that means, but maybe that resonates with you. Info dumps.
Unfortunately, I don't know what that is.
That is not a phrase you recognize.
No, should we
I'm
Google it
too
now?
old.
And
I'm too old to know info dumps.
yeah.
Do either of you have a favorite book that you've written? Kind of like choosing between your children, I understand.
No, I don't really have a favorite book. I mean, I have parts that are the experience of writing it might be a favorite one. So not necessarily for me the outcome of the book, but what I learned about myself, or, you know, the epiphanies I had at different points. Those would be the highlights. How about you, Kevin?
You know, I'm sort of the same, but I would say that I'm always partial to the most recent book I've written. So it would probably be Sex and Vanity for the moment, you know, just because I literally finished it back in February. And so it's still so fresh, and the whole experience of writing it was so fun.
Here's one for Kevin. It says, "Hey Kevin, Curtis C here." Sounds like maybe somebody you know.
Hey Curtis.
Who do you envision playing the leads in Sex and Vanity? Maybe you don't really get a vote in that.
Well, you know, you always ask, you know, this is unfair because I can't say, right? Because if I name an actor, I offend about 400 others. So, but you know, there's so much amazing talent out there. It'll be really, really fun to cast Sex and Vanity. Especially even the supporting characters, you know.
I know Mrs. Zao. I think.
Zao, yeah.
Yeah,
I
have. Yeah, I love her.
Thank you. Yeah, she's going to be very fun to cast, and I of course have already a favorite that I'm hoping will say yes to that.
Fun. I love her.
So. I just hope there's more Henry Golding in the world soon. I mean, seriously. Let's see. Our cousin Charlotte and the creator of Puppy Yoga really involved romantically at the end of the book? That's a pretty arcane question, but.
You know, I mean, I don't want to give away a spoiler to the people who haven't read the book, but I think this person who asked the question should trust her instincts. You know.
Yeah. Open to interpretation, obviously. Yeah. And who was your inspiration for Lucy Churchill's mother? I love that she's a PhD scientist that didn't seem to care about the society she married into.
You know, I have to say, her mother is really inspired by one particular person who is someone very special in my life. So it was fun to sketch out that character based on this one friend.
And that interaction with Mrs. Zao, the two of them together. I just love those two.
Yeah, and I've told this friend that she's the inspiration for the character, but she doesn't believe me. She can't, you know, she's so modest and just self-effacing. She can't believe that, you know, it was fun.
Here's a cute one. Crazy Rich Asians and Joy Luck Club were two of my favorite books and movies. I'm a Black American and recommended the books and movies to all my Asian friends. Did you realize you had a universal appeal along the lines of Black Panther?
You know, I have had so many amazing, so much amazing support from the African American community and so many readers that I've met over the years, you know, who are African American. So I love it, and thank you, you know.
Yeah, anytime you get compared to Black Panther, it's a good day. I think we have maybe time for one or two more questions. What does a typical writing day look like for you? Either one.
Amy?
Typical writing.
I'm definitely not like Kevin, who can write a book in, you know, record time. I've been derailed by everything that's happening in the world now. It just, you know, we got wildfires, we got an election coming, we have the pandemic, and just seems like everything I'm writing seems trivial. And I had to start over and abandon my first book and write something different that is much more, allows me, the immersion that I have in this world is a little closer to what I'm writing. It's not about, you know, all of this, but it has to have elements where I am thinking about the same things.
Do you go into a cave when you write?
I was going to say that means I've been derailed and I have a very fractured life writing. I first, you know, have started accepting doing a lot of these web webinar things, these Zoom things that I never would have done in the past, but I'm thinking, I'm home, I can't write. Yeah, I'll do that. And so I'm not getting as much writing done as I should.
So,
Kevin,
yeah.
more productive.
I try to be, you know, like you also. It's really, I can't imagine if I had to write Sex and Vanity right now. You know, I finished it right before the pandemic sort of began to sort of become real. So in February, I turned in the book, and I'm so lucky I got to finish the book then.
Yeah.
On a normal basis, you know, I do have to create a structure where I'm writing, you know, 5 hours in the morning, 5 hours at night. You know, it is a discipline. You just have to just do it, you know, but I'm always just, for me, always afraid of, like, you know, contractual, not meeting my contracts and, you know, not being a good Boy Scout. So.
The old deadline phobia.
Exactly.
I think this will be our last question. The publishing industry is facing a reckoning over its overwhelming whiteness. How will this change in the coming years? Will it change in the coming years? That's kind of a big question to end an event on. Publishing industry.
I think Amy and I are both lucky in the sense that we managed to get published, you know, in an industry that is overwhelmingly white. And I think that hopefully, you know, what we've done can inspire all the other people out there, you know, who want to write, you know, tell your story, go for it. You know, I never, to this day, I still can't imagine that I got even one book published. But it begins with writing 1 page a day, you know, 1 page after another. And then at some point you have enough of a book that you can start showing to people in the publishing industry. So, you know, hopefully more people take up the challenge and tell their story.
Regardless of what's happening in publishing, we can talk about all of this and their finances and their, you know, what they're pushing for to stay in business. But I think what it boils down to is, as Kevin said, just keep writing. And that's the most important thing. I know that sounds just like a pat homily, but I believe it. I mean, I believed it when I started writing. I'll tell you this one thing. When I did have a surprising success, and somebody told me that what was happening basically in publishing, you know, they need to fill now a little niche. And they said, get me, or who's Amy Tan? And the next one is, get me Amy Tan, get me the next Amy Tan. And then it goes to, who's Amy Tan? So, you know, you have this cycle of what's happening in publishing. And that sounds, you know, like a joke, but there is some truth in there where you have cycles of things that are happening. And so you just have to ignore that and just keep writing. And one day it opens, one day it closes. Something, you know, it sometimes may have to do with, you know, very white publishing or white in any business. But the main thing is not to be crushed by it.
I think that's a great note to end it on. And I want to thank everybody for coming and apologize that we didn't get to all 35 questions. There were almost 300 people on this webinar. So next time perhaps. And I want to thank 7x7 Magazine for co-presenting. And I want to thank Kevin and Amy. And if this were a live event, this is where we'd all be like cheering. So I apologize, you're hearing only silence. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. And you will be getting a survey in the mail, so by email, of course. So please fill that out if you feel so inclined. And check the website because there's lots more to come in the next 16 days. Thank you again, Kevin and Amy. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a
Thank
good night.
you.